as we get near to the end of the Bible, we get to the letters written by some of the other leaders in the earliest church as well as Paul. Hebrews is one that sometimes has been attributed to Paul, but most people think now that it definitely wasn't written by him. But the writer of the Hebrews is looking at how the Christian message fits with the Jewish expectations of the Messiah and with the Jewish law, including some of the ceremonial law, and it's an encouragement really to have faith in God in spite of hardship, and it talks about this great cloud of witnesses who are cheering us on, and all the great men and women of faith of the past and how they can inspire us for today. And so Hebrews contains some kind of quite in-depth looking at the Old Testament, but also these real encouragements about how we live our Christian lives today. James was written probably by Jesus' half-brother, who's a significant leader in the early church. And of course it says that at one point Jesus' family, his brothers and his mum, thought that he'd gone mad, which I guess you might do if your brother went around saying he was the Messiah and with all these people following him. But then Paul tells us that Jesus, when he rose from the dead, he visited James, which I would love to have seen that meeting when your brother turns up and he's died and you think, well, he definitely wasn't who he said he was, and then he just comes and sees you and says, all right, our kid. And he's like, oh, right, okay, so maybe you were who you said you were. But James believes, and he writes a letter which is a bit like a New Testament version of the Proverbs. It's a very Jewish letter, which is possibly why one of the reasons that Martin Luther didn't like it. He felt that it was opposed to Paul's writings about, the Christian message is about grace and not works, whereas James says to us that faith without works is dead. But for me, it's just a complementary thing to that. It's the other side of it. It's if I love my wife, then I will do things for her. And if we love God, then we do things for God, we do works for God, and it's just a natural outworking of our faith, the things that we do. And there's loads of these sayings in James that you think, well, that sounds a bit like Jesus, like at the end of chapter 3, where he says, peacemakers who sow in peace will raise a harvest of righteousness. And you think, that totally sounds like Jesus could have said that. And then you think, actually, this guy grew up with Jesus, so it's quite possible that it was said by him. So James is a really fascinating book letter in that way. Then you've got the letters of Peter. The letters of Peter encourage us to, when we're persecuted, to keep going, to remain focused on our mission that God has called us to, and to keep loving one another. And then we have the letters of John 1, 2 and 3. John wants to remind us to love one another. At the same time as all this writing about love, John also is very black and white. Sometimes if you're feeling a bit wishy-washy in your faith, it's good to read 1 John. If you read it, especially in the Greek, it's very black and white. He basically kind of says things like, you're either love Jesus or you're an Antichrist. It's that kind of thing. Who are you with? Are you with God or not? Make up your mind. And so John will give you a good slap round the face and a kick up the bum at the same time as talking about love and making you feel all nice at the same time. So he's refuting a load of false teachers. He's calling them to be together in community and to love one another in that. And there's a kind of a legend in the early church which said that when John was very ill and very old, they would carry him to different Christian meetings, and he would just lean up and he would say, brothers and sisters, love one another. And that would be his whole sermon, and then they would take him on to somewhere else. And John teaches us about loving Jesus. Jude was another one of Jesus' half-brothers, probably. Most of Jude is in 2 Peter, like really similar stuff and word for word at some points. And most people think that Jude was written first and Peter nicked some of it because it was good. And again, that's similar to Peter in how do we hold on to our faith, how refuting false teachers, and how do we keep focused on Jesus. And finally, we get to Revelation. which is kind of unlike anything else in the New Testament, similar perhaps to Daniel and some bits of Ezekiel. At the first bits of Revelation are these series of letters, 7 letters that Jesus gets John to write to these 7 churches, and then the rest of it is what you call apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic in Jesus' time was a way of expressing this great battle between good and evil, and so the people who were perhaps persecuted, some of them, or finding life difficult on earth, they could know and be reminded that there's a battle going on in heaven, in the heavenly realms, and God wins in the end. It was also a way of describing events on earth as well. So when he says about a beast, the number of the beast, and basically those who have, you'll know who I mean. He's basically saying, who I'm talking about. Perhaps it was Emperor Nero or Domitian, or it was one of the rulers of the time. And this was a way of, apocalyptic could be used to describe people, especially powerful people at the time, and their eventual demise without getting your head chopped off, without getting in too much trouble, because it's an apocalyptic writing. And so it was a critique, if you like, a subversive critique of the powers of the world of that time. And again, just saying, Jesus' kingdom will last. This kingdom will not last. And so there's all sorts of books been written on Revelation, all kinds of money been made out of Revelation, predicting dates and all sorts of things like that, and when Jesus is going to return. The big thing that Revelation does, apart from what I've just said, is that it reminds us that Jesus is putting the world to rights. Revelation 21 verse 5 says, Jesus says, "Behold, I'm making all things new. I'm making all things new." And that is the wonderful promise. There's a day coming when there'll be no more crying and no more pain and no more suffering. The old order of things has gone and the new will have come. And it gives us that hope. It gives us that faith, that rescue plan that kind of came into being in Genesis 12, and that Isaiah told us what it was going to look like, and then we got a clear glimpse of it in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, and then in the best of what his followers have done throughout the earth. The God who started a good work will bring it to completion on the day of Christ Jesus. And so there is a day, the day of Jesus, that is coming. I saw a new heaven, a renewed heaven, if you like, and a renewed earth. He's making everything new. He's not going to just throw it all away. He's going to renew it and heal it, like Jesus's dead body that became this wonderful new thing that was renewed. That is what God's doing in the world. Your labour is not in vain. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, because Jesus is coming again. That great story that begins with God kind of singing the world into being, and yet then we mess it up, and then God says, well, I'm going to renew this thing through you, through these fallen people. I'm going to give you my spirit to do that, and I'm going to give you these examples of these great men and women of faith, and I'm going to give you a glimpse of it in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and then I'm going to fill you with my spirit, and I'm going to send you all across the world to do what Abraham was told that he was going to do, to have faith in God and to be a blessing to all the families of the earth, to be a light to the world, to be the salt of the earth, to be the ones who are there loving people and showing people that another world is possible, and it is possible, and it is coming. And it's not just the stuff that we see in the past, but it's the stuff that we see in the future, that the future has visited us in Jesus. And every time we see someone get healed, and we have the courage to pray for someone to be healed, every time we see two people who used to hate each other because of Jesus forgive each other and come back together, every time we look after the environment in a good way, every time justice is done in our world, that is a glimpse of the future. It's like those spies in the desert who went into the promised land, and they got those grapes, and they brought the grapes from the promised land, and while they were still in the desert, they ate these grapes. They ate the fruit of the future, the fruit of the promised land, and we get to eat the fruit of the promised land in the desert that we're in today. Even though it's difficult, even though life is tough, we get glimpses of the future. We have the hope that comes from what Jesus did, and we have the hope that comes from what Jesus is going to do. But actually, both of those things come and visit us right now in our present day, because that is the story of the Bible, that we write our chapter right now, that we're the people who pray, God, let your kingdom come, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because the prayer that Jesus taught us is the prayer that Jesus will answer in full one day, and the prayer that Jesus loves to answer in our lives right now. That is the story of the Bible, and that is the story that can give hope to us right now and can change the world in which we live. I hope you've enjoyed this Bible overview, and I hope it inspires you to love God more, to follow Jesus better, and to love his word and to explore it more, so that this world might be changed for the better.